This special episode is part of our Critical Engagements with Histories of Whiteness seminar series, in which we explore the shifting contours of racialized whiteness in South Africa, its privileges, policing, and enduring presence in our contemporary landscape. We are joined by Dr. Anell Stacey Daries, who shares her research on the Physical Training Battalion and the broader historical project of shaping white male bodies as armor for citizenship. Through the lens of physical education, she offers a powerful reading of how whiteness was constructed, regulated, and normalized in the making of the modern South African state.
In January 1945, South Africa's first Congress for Physical Education served as a sort of national meeting point for the country's physical education teachers, instructors, and researchers. Initiated as a means to further the cross-institutional implementation and standardization of the subject, the conference brought together leading physical educationalists to present their research findings and to share their experiences and knowledge of the subject. In setting the tone for this 4-day conference, the Secretary for the South African Union's Education Department, Mr. A. Roberts, delivered the opening address. In this speech, he presented an anecdote intended to encapsulate the impetus behind the construction of a uniquely South African physical education system. Roberts stated, and I quote, "During the Anglo-Boer War, it sometimes happened that a boy 14 or 15 would join a commando, and when this happened, the burger tried as far as possible to keep him out of danger. On one occasion, during an engagement, a Boer general was approaching the battlefield, and while still a good distance away, rode up a little koppie in an endeavor to get a bird's-eye view of the terrain. At the top, he came across a scared, or rather scared youngster, lying next to a rifle nearly as long as himself. 'Wat maak jy hier, seun? What are you doing here, son?' asked the general. The boy sprang up to his feet, drew himself up proudly, and said, 'Nee, generaal. No, general,' he said. 'Ek is die versterking. I am the reinforcements. The youngsters are indeed the reinforcements of the nation, and we have as little right to send them into the battlefield of life without the fullest preparation we could give them as to send them into modern warfare, physically unfit and without the proper equipment.' While, end quote, while the origins of physical education practices across Southern Africa have been located in pre-colonial and colonial periods, this 1945 speech detailed the dawn of a nationalist-aligned turn in South African physical education. The aforementioned quote highlights two defining features evident in South African physical education discourse in the first half of the 20th century. The first aspect emphasized is the centrality of childhood and youth development, as notions regarding how standardized physical education could lead, the standardized physical education of children could lead to the salvation of the nation was prevalent throughout the movement. Roberts drew attention to the conceptualization of physical education as a practical remedy to heal social ills. The second feature, outlined by Roberts, related to war nostalgia, which effectively worked to evoke the history of imperial and colonial conquests in Southern Africa. In considering the establishment of government-funded national intervention programs such as the Physical Training Battalion, or PTB from here on out, which is the focus of my lecture here today, the reclamation of often romanticized pre-industrial bodily aptitude, military prowess, and physical dexterity of white settlers remains central in the discourse surrounding the need for institutionalized physical education. On a global scale, physical education had become a matter of national interest since the 19th and early 20th century. In the South African context, prominent mouthpieces in intellectual and political circles began drawing attention to rampant white poverty across South Africa from the 19th century. These fears surrounding white indignancy and impoverishment led the South African government to implement various measures to address that perceived threat of racial purity or threat to racial purity and supremacy. In the wake of the 1932 Carnegie Commission report on the poor white problem in South Africa, one of the ways through which the segregationist state sought to reform, rebuild, and restore whiteness was to perfect the individual and collective white body. So in considering this broader context, in the words of Daniel Hartman Craven, who served as the commanding officer of the PTB from 1942 to 1947, the objective of the PTB was to develop citizens. Admitting white boys aged 15 to 35, the battalion accepted recruits who presented with what he called remedial bodily defects, ranging from early stages of flat foot, muscular weakness, nutritional deficiencies, defective physiques, and certain kinds of defects requiring surgical treatment. With physical education, training, and rehabilitation as central objectives, the cultivation of a well-trained body was not considered to be what Craven called the proficient armor for citizenship. Interlinking the pursuit of the ideal body with the pursuit of the ideal citizen, the pedagogical and ideological premise upon which the PTB was based sought to strike a sort of balance between the perfecting of the body and the refining of the mind. This balance was to be attained through the battalion's 4 pillars, namely remedial training, education, military training, and character building. Lurking behind these pillars was the determination to ensure that the recruits would not become liabilities to the state or dependent on welfare. While acknowledging that some recruits would never be fully reformed or healed of their ailments, the battalion moralized physical capability and mental aptitude. In sanctifying this ability to contribute to the nation's manpower and labor force, the individual's ability to contribute to the country's economy was considered to be an obligation for all citizens. Considering the stipulation that recruits had to present with remedial physical disabilities upon admission, the notion that the individual's willpower and collective manpower could be forged through physical training permeated the conceptual foundations upon which the PTB was founded. While situating my examination of the PTB's history within the context of the broader socio-political conditions of the late 1930s and 1940s, I am interested in tracing the impetus behind the establishment of the Physical Training Battalion. In doing so, I intend to focus on the battalion's approach to social and individual reform. Considering this examination, I argue that in efforts to produce citizens, national ideals were printed onto the very bodies of young white men and boys. This form of structured and institutionalized education and physical training expanded beyond the perfecting of the individual. Notwithstanding the fact that the PTB was instated to respond to impending social, health, and economic factors, the desire to create a strong workforce became tied to the making of citizens. So, while poverty affected all South Africans from all social strata, white poverty was catapulted to the forefront of national anxieties in the last decades of the 19th century. As discussed in the joint findings and recommendations of the Carnegie Commission's report investigating the poor white problem in South Africa, poor whiteism denoted the social and economic retrogression of a considerable portion of the white, primarily rural or formerly rural population. In the 5-volume study funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and published in 1982, as I noted, the poor white problem put forth 2 central questions. The first question examined the extent to which white poverty was caused by social ills. The second question interrogated the means by which white poverty could be cured or prevented. Regarding specific demographics, the study's findings noted that economic and social decline in white settler populations was particularly noticeable among older settler colonial populations. Furthermore, The report indicated that economic decline came about as a result of, and I quote from the report, inadequate adjustment to modern economic conditions among a portion of the older white population in South Africa, end quote. Contending that this population had been severed from European progress and development for many generations, the report indicated that older colonial settler populations lived in a subsistence economy with negligible differences between rich and poor. Last, the discovery of diamonds and gold, the capitalistic exploitation of the mines, the influx of immigrants with a modern business outlook, and the rapid penetration of the railways into the interior quickly forced the country into industrialization from the 1880s. Older white settler populations were thus thrusted into a changed socioeconomic landscape for which they were ill-equipped and unprepared. In the last years leading up to the outbreak of World War II, the projected impact of white poverty gripped the South African zeitgeist. As detailed in a report outlining the PTP's history, and I quote from the report, for some time, a serious consideration had been given to the problem of dealing with the boys and men who were ineligible for enlistment into existing battalions, end quote. Prospective recruits were mainly found ineligible on grounds of being below enlistment age, not meeting the required educational qualifications, or physical unfitness. Due to the efforts of Mr. G.A.C. Kutschke, the Secretary for Social Welfare, the unfitness of white men for military service was brought to national attention at a conference hosted in Cape Town in September 1938. In which representatives from the Departments of Social Welfare, Defense, Labor, and Public Health were present, along with the economic benefits that would emanate from a proposed scheme tasked with the responsibility of reforming the youth. The Department of Social Welfare was, and I quote again from the report, keenly interested in the reconditioning of youths and young men who, on account of remedial defects, were not in the position to secure employment in the open labor market. It was felt that unless physical defects were remedied at an early stage, there was always a certainty that a considerable portion of these persons would become permanently unfit for the remainder of their lives, end quote. The outcome of this above-mentioned and subsequent conferences was the proposal to establish the K platoons named after Kutschke. On 14 February 1940, the proposed scheme was instated to form 2 K platoons with what they called 50 semi-fit details in each unit. Established at Fort Rickardshoogte in Pretoria, the K platoons were attached to the junior company of the 1st Special Service Battalion. Upon admission, recruits were required to take an oath to serve anywhere in Africa. Once recruits were determined fit for military service, they would be transferred to appropriate branches. Commenting on the bodybuilding work of the SSB and other SSB Special Service Battalion and other prominent youth battalions operating at the time, the co-editor of the Rand Daily Mail stated in an article from 1940, and I would like to read this quote to you as well. While we think of the lads who have thus been brought into the limelight, we dare not forget those who still linger in the shadows as spectres menacing the future of the South African nation. The unfit are prolific breeders. In the case of the poorly educated young men of the Pioneer Battalion at Bloemfontein, bodybuilding has been so successful that the battalion staged a great physical training display, according to the local Afrikaans newspapers, that not only equaled but surpassed anything the Special Service Battalion could show. Doctors do not nowadays make a fetish of medicine, since natural methods can do so much to correct defects. Sunbathing has done much for the Special Service Battalion boys who apply olive oil to the skin. Physical exercise, semi-nudism, daily showers, and vigorous rubbing have all worked wonders. Then there is this new system of dieting arranged by government experts, in which vegetables and dried fruit have a large place. Sports of all kinds is encouraged. The mind is almost completely renewed and is charged with creative energy. I am sure that the commission consisting of defense, education, and medical experts would be a valuable way of tackling this C3 menace. We need all available manpower. South Africa has Europe impinging on its borders in an aggressive manner, which foretells of future struggles. End quote. As World War II waged on, anxiety surrounding the future of the battalion persisted. Despite apprehensions, the state remained invested in the K platoon's mission to rehabilitate the Union, what they called the Union's substandard human assets, end quote, demonstrating the support received. The battalion was expanded and received battalion status in January 1941. Now the K Battalion, the unit operated under its own commanding officer responsible for the general organization, administration, and ordinary military training of the unit. In March 1942, the K Battalion was renamed again to form the Physical Training Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel Danny Craven was appointed as the new commanding officer. Craven's first task was to reorganize the battalion's activities and to correlate the work of all departments within the battalion. Outlining his framework for the PTB, Craven quotes Plato stating, and I quote, "Give me gymnastics for the body and music for the soul. Too much gymnastics will breed brutes and too much music will make women out of men," end quote. For Craven, provided that there were no congenital obstacles, it was easy to give a boy a sound body. The difficult feat was developing a sound mind. Here, sound is used in a sort of operative sense to convey the objectives of the educational system constructed by the PTB. This system prioritized cleanliness and the overall development by first stressing that the mind should be cleaned and developed to its full capacity and potentiality. Second, the body should be clean and trained inside and out. For Craven, only once this balance was struck could one speak of physical education. Physical education was thus expected to go beyond physical training and to penetrate the precincts of the mind, spirit, and character. This approach to development emulated the tenets of muscular Christianity, which endeavored to mold boys and men into good Christian gentlemen by encouraging Christian manliness through competitive games and education in the classics and spiritually grounded notions of discipline, respect, and morality. As part of the PTB's objectives, the cultivation of a sound body and mind was attained through 4 key focus areas. First, was attained through key focus areas. First, to achieve a sound mind, the battalion had 4 key focus areas, namely schooling, character building, religion, and the useful employment of leisure time. In order to attain a sound body, the battalion also had another set of 4 focus areas, which was medical services, physical and remedial training, recreation, and military training. Categorizing the types of recruits into 4 groups, Craven noted that the boys and young men who ended up in the PTB came from all classes of our, as in his, population. The first group were boys of wealthy parents who had, and I quote this directly from Craven, everything given to them and thus suffered physically as a result. The boys in this group had enough money to attend bioscopes and other entertainment and had enough money to buy sweets and other things between meals. Some of these boys are wrongly fed and thus underdeveloped. The second category included boys who were victims of the transition to the mechanical age and industrialization. Craven noted that while recruits in this group could come from any socioeconomic background, their lack of physical activity, poor town planning, and their lack of access to recreational facilities limited their physical exercise. This third category, noted by Craven, included boys who had physical defects of the body as a result of bad habits. The fourth category comprised of boys who came from impoverished backgrounds. While Craven made the distinction that the PTB was not a home for the poor, recruits in this last category were in the majority. In efforts to instill desirable character traits in the boys, which reflected that of ideal citizens, Craven notes the following, that the PTB introduced a principle of achievement. Upon admission, boys were expected to sort of work their way up this ladder until they were put in what was called the advanced company. According to Craven, entrance into this elite tier was subject to 4 principles. There's a trend of 4 in Craven's work, which he contended governed the participation of Greek athletes in the Olympic Games. The first principle was that the athlete had to be Greek. In relating this to the PTB's environment, PTB boys were expected to be loyal to their battalion in all their actions and their words. The second principle stated that the Greek athlete had to train for 10 months prior to the Olympic Games in order to ensure physical fitness. In relating this to the PTB environment, Craven noted that only the fittest boys were admitted into the advanced company. The third principle on which the PTB character development or character building was based noted that the Greek athlete had to be unstained by sins against the gods or crimes against the state. Translated to the PTB, it was expected that a model battalion boy was disciplined and displayed good character. The last principle stated that the Greek athlete had to take an oath at the altar of Zeus to the effect that he would compete fairly. Translated to the PTB, the boys and young men admitted into the advanced company were expected to emulate leadership and sportsmanship qualities. It was only once the boys attained entry into this advanced company that they could hope to leave the battalion having progressed successfully. Moreover, it was from this group that certain recruits were selected to serve in what they called the self-government system. The self-government system was comprised of captains who were the eyes and ears of staff. These recruits were expected to take control, and I'm quoting Craven again, take control of any situation in which wrong elements have been admitted, end quote. Besides the advanced company, recruits who were well behaved, having never transgressed or who reformed, were awarded good conduct flashes, and this included recruits who couldn't physically participate in any of the competitive games or physical training components that the PTB used. So, in efforts to move away from the battalion's militarized foundations and considering the range of physical and mental disabilities of the recruits, mandatory squad drills and instructions on the use of rifles were not considered to be suitable. The military training implemented in the battalion was modified to, once again quote from Craven, suit the temperament of the boys so that boys will not be turned into adult soldiers or miniature men, end quote. Responding to concerns that military training offered by the battalion could lead to the creation of an organization likened to the Hitler Youth Association, Craven noted that there is no more militarism in the encampment than in the cadet corps present at schools. According to Craven, the PTB's military training did not include punishment, disciplinary measures, or repression. By 1945, Craven had released a statement stating that the battalion would be moved from Pretoria, Voortrekkershoogte, to Kimberley, with its staff of nearly 100 and its 1,000 recruits. From its inception, the battalion functioned under the control of the Departments of Defense and Social Welfare. As part of demobilization efforts, the PTB was to come under the control of the Union Education Department. Under Craven, the PTB moved away from its initial militarized focus and sought to teach and train recruits on how to become physically capable and mentally proficient citizens who turned to religion and pleasant recreational activities to release the bonds of constant self-discipline. In its evolution from Kutschke's K platoons to Craven's PTB, the impetus to transform recruits into industrious and self-disciplined citizens able to contribute to the nation remained central. Drawing on the expertise of qualified medical officers, teachers, and psychologists, the molding of white boys and men's minds and bodies expanded beyond individual benefit. The redemption and civilizing of their bodies and minds served to buttress the strengthening of a nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, I was thinking at the very beginning of your tenure at AVReQ, you presented a different presentation. I just want to try and find a way of connecting the two, because I think that one was also about the body, about physical training of the body, but more as a nationalistic pursuit. Am I right in saying that? Because it was more, it seemed, if I remember correctly, the time frame was much closer to the apartheid era.
That one focused on my PhD work, where I traced the development of physical education as an academic discipline from 1937 to 2019. This one ends just before Craven returns to Stellenbosch. So it ends just before apartheid is ushered in 1948.
But does it end? I mean, does this end? Because that's really my point. Does this end? Is there a kind of a continuity of this? Because I'm interested in the notion of the building of bodies as a strengthening of the white nation and into the apartheid era, and how this idea of the physical body of what it means to be white spilled over into a kind of a special sense of being, a special sense of identity of whiteness that was associated with this physical training, this embodied kind of nationalism. So did it end, or is there like a much more like of a continuity, even though the structure itself of what Danny Craven was doing may have ended, but the idea of the physical training continued? Would that be correct? Because I mean, even tracing physical education in the way that you presented, it seemed to me that it began around that period, just pre-apartheid.
It does begin around that period, and to connect it to what I did previously, when physical education started as a subject at Stellenbosch University in 1939, Claude Smith, who is the head of education in the Transvaal, he comes to Stellenbosch and he speaks to this sort of like third group. The discipline is new, and he's speaking to the students, and the first thing he says to them, if the sort of, and I'm paraphrasing, if the strengthening of your nation is not the reason why you're taking up this discipline, then you should not pursue physical education. So in terms of physical education becoming the sort of firstly an academic discipline, which is a little different to what I'm focusing on here today, because that is sort of the practical implementation of physical education and practically how physical education played out in the world. How physical education then starts at Stellenbosch University is a little different in the sense that they are seeking to train teachers, instructors, and physical educationalists. The undertone thereof is about strengthening a nation, because they weren't speaking to the South African population broadly. When I write about physical education, and particularly this physical education movement, I speak about physical education for the broader South African Black population, even in some cases for women, is seen as a byproduct of a white-centered masculine discipline. So when he mentions, I think I said this quote in my talk when he speaks about members of our population, he's not speaking broadly to the South African population, because he's firstly speaking at a 1945 conference in which that was segregated and the audience, he was speaking to a particular audience. He was also catering to white boys and men. So the first principle upon which character building is based, he says that the athlete has to be Greek. There's also a particular ethnic component to it because he's speaking about the Afrikaans body, the Afrikaner body. Very early on in some of the other documents detailing the founding of the PTB, there is some record where he says we are majority, there's a majority of Afrikaner boys in the camp with the exception of 4 English-speaking boys. So even that specification, the audience that they were speaking to was primarily white, male, Afrikaner. And that's why I might be going on a little long. That's why I preface the talk about the poor white problem. The poor white problem is sort of this underlying issue that influences the development of standardized physical education programs in the country. And then everything else is then seen as a byproduct. So when you read things from the first physical education journal that was actually started at Stellenbosch University, but for some reason we don't have a copy of this journal. This first physical education journal, there's a small little insert in which they speak about physical education for the natives. And even in that, the civilizing rhetoric is that we need to teach them competitive games and not stick fighting. That's what they're doing on the mines. So it was essentially a white-centered male.
Which makes it even more intriguing, actually, because it's the building of white bodies and building of whiteness. And the link to the poor white problem makes it even more stark that it was about removing, almost like separating whiteness completely, because there was, Black poverty as well as white poverty. But what distinguishes this training is to remove white bodies and white people actually from poverty in a very focused way, not only in terms of creating opportunities for employment through the railways and post office and so on, but also in terms of the strengthening of the body. It's such I wonder, can you say something about that, this idea of the strengthening of the white body and how that racialization of that practice was the timing of the racialization, the 1930s, how that may have contributed into the strengthening, the national strengthening of the nation of that was ushered in now into apartheid.
So I like this point that you're raising about the need for separation, because it brings me back sort of to the poor white problem. Because in it, I read, especially for my PhD, I read especially the one report on the health crisis. And in it, they speak about midwifery.
Midwifing.
Yeah, that part. They speak about it, and then the issue is that Black woman is involved in the midwifery, that they are assisting white women in having children. So this idea of close contact and leading to miscegenation and bloedskande and defiling of the blood. So this need to separate, and also in that process, separation needs to be tied to this idea of redemption. And that is what I focus on in my work with physical education, because in a lot of the work being produced on physical education in the 1930s is this need to reform whiteness. Not this idea of the survival of the fittest, the fittest will survive, is that the population that we do have needs to be reformed, needs to be restored. When they speak about the substandard human assets in the union, there wasn't any idea of casting them out. And physical education was a means through which to strengthen the white body, not because there was inherently that they could see that inherently, because there's also, let me get to the point I'm trying to make, is also about class, because you also need to bring in a class conversation. So in this idea of strengthening, it's not just this idea of white supremacy being afforded automatically, is that we have to redeem the white body.
And the notion of the armor of citizenship, that just the image of an armor, like the strengthening of the body, make it an armor of the nation almost beyond citizenship,
to make it indestructible. And when I speak about the white body, I don't speak about the white body as this individual thing, because it was always the collective, the strengthening of the white body, the training of young white men. It wasn't just about strengthening themselves in this individual pursuit of personal strength. It was also with this notion of building a strong nation. Inversely, for white women, the image of the volksmoeder then becomes, your body is then offered as to strengthen the nation, because you need to birth the nation, you need to train the nation. So for white men, in my work on physical education, it's about the strengthening of the body for the benefit of the nation.
And so in a way, even, and I'm going to open it to the floor now, it seems to me there's such a strong link also with the South African Defence Force, because in a way you are training, there is this embrace of the Defence Force as another site for training, because some of what's going on here, although it says no, not the youth, but it is actually, it sort of resonates with that preparation for the feelings of soldierly action.
Yeah, because there's also a need for this during the war. So this is like in the time of World War II. So there's a need, there's a focus on the military. We can't afford to have men with flat feet, they need to fight. So there's also this immediate need for strong soldiers.
Yeah. So we invite questions, Tabolwetu, and then we'll come to Tabolwetu first.
Thank you so much, Doc, for that illuminating talk, and I really enjoyed interest in masculinities. And I'm thinking about that, and thinking about what Prof said about the continuities of the language. In my honors research, I found out that even in romantic relationships, men engage and make sense of romantic relationships within a language of war, within a language of war and all of those things, and seeing those continuities and engaging them like that. And do you think there's something that can be said, for example, about how there's a universalization of white masculinities, right? And ultimately, which informs that kind of continuity in the language of war, in the language of, what did I say? Yeah, war nostalgia, life as a battlefield, and all of those things. Do you think through colonization, through apartheid, and all of the kind of consciousnesses that go with that, there is this universalization of white masculinities within which we see with the language that is used currently?
I like this question because it's sort of taking my work more to the theoretical realm, but let me bring it back to specifically what I'm doing. I'm speaking here about the social engineering project. This is a project implemented by the state. Yes, they are drawing later on in trying to make sense of the physical education movement. They're drawing on war nostalgia. They're drawing on this need to train the youth. So when I prefaced my talk in the beginning on the 1945 first physical education conference to take place in South Africa, they used this imagery of the Anglo-Boer War to sort of show the necessity for physical education. Because in the same way, because they're sort of equating life and war. So on the one hand, we can't send our youth into the world unfit and unprepared, but they are using the imagery of war at the same time to say that we would never send our youth into war unfit and unprepared. So just to separate the two, on the one hand, I'm speaking about like efforts from the Union Defence Force to implement a battalion to fix white men's flat feet. On the other end, you do see how in the process of making sense of the foundations of physical education, war imagery is used. And then that's seen more broadly also, but I won't go into that too long. But I do think it's necessary because I see it in other places in the research that I do, where war nostalgia and this necessity to create strong men who are always prepared to fight, who are always prepared to defend their land, to defend their nation, to defend their women, to defend their children. It's then imbued in language more broadly, but particularly here, I'm looking at sort of like a specific social engineering project. I hope that answers.
Thank you.
Sophia, yes. Sophia, the other hands, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much. So, Anell, thank you so much. Always such a pleasure to hear you speak. And I know that you're an historian, but I feel you also have such an aptitude for contemporary social critique. So I'm really curious about your take on the legacy of this kind of intertwining of defense and whiteness. And I'm thinking in particular at this sort of historical juncture where there is this renewed kind of language on the global stage of defense and conflict and preparation. And, you know, as Prof mentioned, there's the South African National Defense Force. And then, you know, on the other side of the spectrum, that kind of white genocide fears and that kind of getting like amped up to new levels. Yeah, and I'm just kind of curious if you, how you see that playing out, you know, especially in the, my reading is that in post-apartheid South Africa, it was almost like Germany getting demilitarized, like our idea of being a defensive state kind of needed to be undone. And what does it mean in contemporary 2025 South Africa to think about defense? You know, is it like, how does that legacy affect today, like our thinking of defense?
Thank you, Sophia, for that question and always bringing me into the contemporary. But even in that, history is central. Because what we draw on is then, like I spoke about in my talk, this romanticized perception of the militarized, industrious white body, and also this idea of being under threat. You see it in earlier times, during the 1930s. You see it that ushers in when apartheid is ushered in, and you see it today. And I think the part that fascinates me is how history is then used as a tool to legitimate what is happening in the present. And then how history is then not, I wouldn't say distorted, but how history is used to justify what is happening in the present. And that is why I'm so fascinated in us going to the past and tracing how these things have played out before, because then it's easier to make sense of the present. Because we've seen this before. Like, this isn't foreign to us. Yes, you can't make a one-to-one comparison. That is an error. But it's also an important tool to make sense of the present. To read the past within its context and to read also what is happening today, because it's a flawed interpretation to make a one-to-one comparison and say, oh, what's happening in America now? Oh, that is Nazism. It's not one-to-one, but these are tools that we use to make sense of the present. That helps.
Okay. I mean, it does. I mean, we've encountered these issues in our conversations here at AVReQ. The importance of history, the importance of historicizing these legacies. Because you're right, of course, you can't, you know, it's not comparing, it's not like a one-on-one comparison. But certainly in terms of trends and patterns, one can draw, you know, from these experiences. The importance is that history matters. Mm-hmm. You know, history matters in the work that we do, in even thinking about trauma. History matters in how we think about, you know, historical memory or trauma itself, or the wounds of colonialism, for example, and how those legacies endure. History matters right at the heart of it. And so which is why you know, I'm really so intrigued with some of the stuff that you're bringing into our paper to help us think about, you know, what does it mean? What's the resonance of those legacies today? How do we expand the thinking from here to thinking about what happens elsewhere? Could you just say your name, please?
Ruan,
and then Trader. So you'll ask those questions after each other. So Ruan and then Trader.
Thank you very much, Anell. Quick question on were they the boys that they regress? I'm thinking of Neil Rose's work on governing whiteness, and did some of the boys act out and critique, or was it just Dr. Craven saying that they're acting out?
Fredo?
Yeah, and what really struck me that Dr. Craven, if one thinks of the whole Wilgenhof story and the value systems, I mean, it hit me between the eyes, really. The value system seems good, but what are the costs of it? So that toughness was very interesting. The other one is that women were just totally dismissed and unimportant, was actually also part of a history. But then one thing that I'm also looking at the legacy of this. If one thinks those young men who came out of that system, it's probably their sons who did military service in the townships and on the border and so on. I have a huge concern about the effects of the many younger men. I'm talking 50 to 65 age group almost, who've not been properly debriefed after their military service. The effect that has on management styles, domineering management styles, on marriages, on decisions still. And it was a legacy that probably came from their fathers, who might have been part of this group. So to me, it's quite interesting, that kind of legacy.
Father.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to, everyone has left, but I think it would be valuable for the audience it was only a 30-minute, 25-minute talk, so I couldn't really mention a lot of that. But I think what everyone asked was, did the boys rest? And then there was another one about, did the boys act out? So about rest, I think by the time Craven takes over the PTB, he sort of starts to push for a form of demobilization and sort of decouples it from its foundations as being a battalion that was sought to train boys to reintroduce them or to introduce them into the army. So rest and leisure and the use of what he called pleasant recreational activities was always central. And Craven being Craven, I mean, today I realize that a lot of people don't really know Craven, but Craven was, but I guess people at Stellenbosch should know Craven. There's a statue of Craven at your sports field, so you should know. He sort of introduces the pleasant competitive game. So he introduces sort of rugby and other play and other things that the boys could do to play, because he realizes that the boys, by the time they get to the PTB, don't know what games are. He says something to the effect that these boys don't know how to play. And I found that very striking. And then in terms of acting out, it's very hard at this point, especially with the documents that I have access to find out whether these boys acted out or not. But there is some indication to that in what Craven says, is because some boys with juvenile records end up in the PTB. So these are also boys sort of from a troubled past or troubled homes that end up in the PTB. So boys who have sort of had issues before they get to the PTB. And then in the case where they had boys that they were struggling with, they would send them to the banks of the Hartbeespoort Dam so they could engage in some pleasant activities. So that would include fishing, they could join a choir, they could do these recreational activities to push back at this notion. So that last line in the talk, to break the bonds of self-discipline. So there was this level of awareness that they were dealing with a specific kind of boy, and that the majority of the boys in the battalion came from poor homes, that they didn't have access to these things in the first place. So I think that's what makes the PTB so interesting to me, is because it operates as part of the Union Defence Force, but it's operating differently under Craven, which is very fascinating. And then it comes to the next question about value systems. Again, I think my response will be similar to my response that I gave to Sophia. Making a one-to-one comparison is sort of dangerous because history doesn't operate in that sort of way. History is necessary in order to see these themes, in order to see certain patterns in the present. That is necessary. We need to understand our past to also understand how we get to the present, but also making the one-to-one comparison is a bit dangerous, especially in the current dispensation that we are in. However, the value systems is striking to me, and I sort of read that value systems as a governing system. It's not something that the boys were forced to participate in, but it dictated how they governed themselves, because there was a reward at the end that could be included in the advanced company, and it's only once you get access to the advanced company that you completed your course successfully. Obviously there were boys who couldn't, but there was other sort of things that they could be awarded with in place of getting into the advanced company. But it created a sort of social hierarchy, and that is how citizenship plays out also in the real world. It's like kind of this sort of social hierarchy. So in terms of trying to trace these themes, you can draw it into a contemporary situation vis-a-vis Bourgeois, but also we need to read these things within its time and within its context.
Evelyn?
Obviously, the stress on physical fitness was the same in Germany at the same time, even starting earlier with the Summer Olympics and '56. And what I find interesting is that that had a very strong influence on the visual arts. It started, colossal statues that was based on the Roman and Greek art, because that was considered to be free of any Jewish influence. But the statues themselves, they were momentous, massive, and they showed the Nordic influence, the strength and the power of the male white. I don't know if there is a parallel here in this country, but I doubt this.
Not on the scale, thank you for your question, not on the scale, but in other ways. There's also a very strong European influence in standardized physical education. Initially, because of British colonial presence, there was a strong British influence. So you see the cadet corps and what is this? Words evade me. The cadet corps and this militarized fashion of walking, this marching performances and all this, very British influence. But then something happens in the 30s where they want to sort of standardize physical education, because at that point, South African physical education was drawing influence from all sorts of places other than the indigenous physical education practices. So there was a lot of Swedish influences, German influences, some American influences. And then they introduced the first physical education textbook in 1938. They introduced the first physical education textbook. And then what ends up influencing the physical education movement over British physical education is Danish physical education, introduced by Niels Buch, who was a Nazi sympathizer. And then he comes here and he is fascinated by white men's bodies. He is fascinated by rugby, by their performance, what their bodies look like. And he sort of writes a paper in 1938 or 1939, and he speaks about Boer physical education, for a Boer physical education that indigenizes the practice, draws on European physical education practices, but indigenizes the practice to suit the South African system. And yet again, the standardized physical education system becomes once again a white-centered movement, and everything else is then sidelined from it. But in terms of your initial question, not at the same scale, but you do see influences in South Africa.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. I think there's this theme of how women have been left out of a lot of the sort of nationalist agenda in the explicit way. And I'm interested in this idea of like this massive social engineering project dedicated to shaping and what you say reforming and restoring white men's bodies. And I was wondering if there was any sort of concerted social engineering-esque type project for women to shape them into that figure of the volksmoeder, like in the same way or adjacently.
Yes. Because physical education was tied to education, education was considered to be a suitable career path for women. So at Stellenbosch in 1937, when the first physical education degree course is introduced. Women are included. One of the earliest standardized physical education courses is introduced by Margaret C. Black for white women in the Cape. Today, Mowbray. In 1920, introduced in 1920. There's a hall named after, nobody knows who she is. There's a hall named after one of...
That's what was resonating to me. I remember the hall.
Yes, there's a hall named after, and nobody knows who she is. She comes here, she introduces a physical education course for white women, and she sort of like ushers in this movement to develop physical education instructors that were trained in South Africa. Because up until that point, they are importing physical education experts from Europe. And funny enough, the first standardized physical education course is designed for white women. But it's sort of this, you see it there, you see it in Stellenbosch, where there's this sort of freedom even to white women, but still within constraints. And you see it at Stellenbosch, where not their citizenship, but their position within the university is constricted. So they're allowed to study here, they're allowed to be here, but what they dress, how they engage with male students, how they engage in public, for instance, in a letter written to the church from the Dutch, to the university from the Dutch Reformed Church, scolding the institution for not telling physical education women students to dress appropriately, because they need to remember that they are the beacons of morality. You need to think of the sedelike welsyn van die dames-studente, the moral well-being of the women students, because of the surrounding colored population. And in that, they're speaking about where we are today, they're speaking about deflector. So you need to consider the surrounding color.
I mean, there's a question we have some people online, but I wonder, isn't there something here about the control also, almost like the using physical education as a form of control of the white body in a range of ways, all in terms of, engineering a kind of a healthy nation, but via this control of the body. Isn't there something here also about, state control of the bodies of white men and then, of course, of men, but men especially because of this patriarchal vision as well?
I think there's something inherent to standardized physical education. There's a lot of research done on how physical education operated in pre-colonial societies, but this type of physical education that comes with colonization, and my specific interest in the educationist period, is about constriction, is about control, how you are expected to move gracefully, how you are expected to contort your body. So for instance, the images that I use throughout my talk, but within that, there is an idea of constriction and control, because you are expected to move within confinements. I'm looking particularly at physical education, not just as a tool to, like I said, strengthen the body, because that's what exercise is. That's what physical culture was. Physical culture very early on, that was operating around this time. But physical education then becomes also tied to a national education. And that's why I'm sitting between this concept of nationalism and citizenship. Because nationalism, especially in the South African context, is tied to Afrikaner nationalism, and that has particular connotations with a particular by a particular government. But this is also about creating ideal citizens. So there is a relationship between the physically educated and the creation of citizens.
How would you if you were to design a postgraduate course, how would you draw from this field of work to introduce a debate, a particular kind of debate on how we understand racialized bodies, for example, which is one of our interests at AVReQ?
Particularly drawing on my training as a historian, contextualizing these debates is very important to me. So firstly, understanding how these events play out in its time is very important. And then in my interest in being in an interdisciplinary center, I would like to see how that history is firstly interpreted and how it is understood in the present. So this distinction between history and processes of memorialization. And bringing that conversation back to conversations surrounding the processes of racialization, quite often these processes are abstracted. It's as though these things exist divorced from the concrete world around us. Hence why some of the work that I have done here at AVReQ forces students to go outside and to see the world around them and to see how history is present, how history is layered. An example of this to the audience who's maybe not aware of the work that I do, Stellenbosch University is one of my most central sites of engagement in my research. And I turned part of my PhD into a walking tour. And one of the sites that I visit is the parking behind our building. And recently, or a year or so ago, we had a counter surveyor, Sadiq Matala. So there's an example of how I would bring in my own work. We had Sadiq Matala visit our institution, visit our center, and he could layer and superimpose maps of during apartheid, before apartheid, to the present. And today, when we look at this parking, we see it as a parking, there's a functional use, but there is people within living memory who are still alive, who are able to trace their homes to our parking. And that is how history plays out. It's not something that is far removed. Like, for instance, when I speak about physical education, people always ask, like, why are you playing these old British birthday videos? But I remember as a child having to do Jan Pierawiet in grade R.
Yes.
And that's where Jan Pierawiet comes from. So if I am to bring my work into an interdisciplinary center, I do need to speak about the contemporary implications of the past. But if I am to stay true to my training as a historian, I also need to speak about history within its time, within its context, to make sure that I don't impose a contemporary lens onto the past.
Yeah, but at the same, so it's a critical balance, really, you know. And I wonder to what extent, I mean, this idea of always stressing the contemporary, to do that, but at the same time to always actually speak about the legacies as well.
And I like that word. I like the language of legacies, because legacies that will speak about the contemporary implications of the past. And I think I would draw on the language of legacies and the afterlife of this place, of these histories. I think that's important, is the language that we use to make sense of the past.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking all the time, I want to think also not so much about Danny Craven, but about the significance of rugby also, because it seems to have been such an important or a significant reference point. I mean, this Danish man who observes that these bodies of rugby, that's not out of the blue. That's not insignificant, and it's an observation that is based on something that actually was deliberately developed to build these white bodies so that they make that impression to the outside world, right? And so in a way, it's a positioning of the white body in the world, so to speak. I mean, I may be stretching it a bit, but that is the intention, you know. The foreigners come and say, wow, these bodies. And rugby, being what it is and what it has represented over the years, speaks to that issue of, you know, this is the national pride, not only as a sport, but also as what is visible in terms of who is representing this nationality.
Because this is also some of the work that I did, it's by the time we reached democracy, physical education is sort of phased out as an independent subject. Because of the connotations that physical education has up until that point, because of our militarized past, and how tied that subject becomes to the past regime. And then it's replaced by life orientation, which takes on a social justice kind of awareness. I mean, all of us as OBE kids here, or most of us as children who had to go through life orientation, it takes on a different national narrative. And that's sort of how I read rugby in the current dispensation. It's part of our national narrative. So that image of Nelson Mandela standing next to Francois Pienaar holding up the trophy, it becomes ingrained in our national narrative. Because now, in the process of building and reforming South Africa and building a new nation, we need a new narrative. So the narrative of rainbowism, the notion of being one. So we see that what is it, stronger together is our new slogan. So over time, the rugby is then sort of used as part of our national narrative. This happens earlier on, and there's other work that focuses more closely on rugby, but I'm going to tie it more to my work on physical education. I think the question
now is the
okay.
Question is, are you going to read it, Caesar? Yeah.
I was wondering about the archives on the PTB. Is there more material to explore? I was wondering about how the boys' sexuality was disciplined and educated, for example. You mentioned something about how unfit boys breed too much. Something like that. Was physical training viewed as an instrument of population control there?
In terms of the archive, in my own research, I came across a few articles. One set of articles was published in 1938 in Stellenbosch University's Journal on Physical Education. It was later taken over by the state, and it became Vigor, and there was a few physical education journals. But I was stuck. I was stuck in my PhD. I couldn't find anything. I found here and there a few newspaper articles where I could correlate what I was looking for. Luckily, Rand Daily Mail digitized a lot of their newspapers. I could find a few things. And it was only until Prof. Groenlum sent me an email, and he said, I have some stuff for you that you might be interested in, and I'll bring it to you. And he brought me a file, and that file had reports in it and newspaper articles. And since then, I went to the National Archives, and I was able to correlate most of the findings that I had. There's very little on the Physical Training Battalion in terms of the boys' perspective. So that day-to-day on the ground experiences, there's very little on that. So what I could read was reports on the PTB, newspaper articles speaking about what was happening in the camp. I think I came across 2 newspaper articles. And unfortunately, because of Danny Craven's celebrity status, everything speaks about how the young recruits would smile when they see him, and how little discipline was happening on the ground. So I also have to read it in the sense that Danny Craven was also like popular, and he was a figure, and he was a celebrity. So a lot of these on the ground experiences speaks more about Craven's celebrity status than it speaks about that real world experience. But just to respond briefly again to Louise, this is ongoing work. So I'm in the archive looking for more work on the PTB.
Thank you for listening to the AVReQ podcast. For more insights, research, and reflections, visit our website or follow us online and join the reparative journey.